This is the North Face Wawona 6 tint. I spent the last 24 days putting this tint to the test, including in sunny days like today, but also in multiple rainy days and even in high 15 to 25 mile per hour winds. As I was doing this testing, I gave this tint a quality score in 10 different quality categories. And if I sum up all of the points of those various categories, it allows me to give the tint an overall score out of 100. And so as I go through this video, I'm going to walk you through how this tint performed in each of these various quality categories. And I'm also going to, at the end of this video, summarize everything, give you a total score, and tell you who should actually buy this tint. Now, before we get into it, it is important for me to mention that this is the new version of this tint. There is currently also selling an older 2020 model of the North Face Wawona 6 that you can get for about $25 cheaper. And so if you're interested in the new version, this is it. Now let's jump right in with quality category number 1. The first thing to look at is the setup difficulty. This is important because it's one of the things that will form your first impression about any tint. So let's look at that for this North Face Wawona 6 tint. If you look at the overall design of the tent, you may notice that it has roughly a dome style shape to it. However, it does have 2 additional poles that allows it to create this extended vestibule or mudroom that goes out the front of the tent. But that does add some additional complexity to the setup process. And so if you look at a scale of points from 1 to 10, I consider a 5 on this scale to be roughly average for a tent. And so that would be something like the REI Base Camp, which kind of mimics your typical dome style shape. However, I would call this tent a little bit more difficult to put up than that one, so I'll give it a score of 4 out of 10. Category number 2 is the layout of the tent. So if you look inside this tent, there's a couple interesting things to mention. First of all, on the downside, this tent has a pretty small internal area if you look at only the meshed in area. So in other words, not counting the vestibule space. And in fact, the square footage or the floor area of the tent is 960 feet, which to compare it with something else, if you look at the Eureka Copper Canyon, which is a much larger tent, the floor area on the inside is 1,200 feet, which of course is much, much more. Or if you compare it to something that's a little bit closer, the REI Wonderland is 1,000 feet, and that is still larger than the inside of this tent. However, there are several things to like about the layout of this tent. For example, it has surprisingly good headroom for a dome style tent, and in fact, it's rated as having a peak height of 80 inches. In reality, that doesn't seem quite right. I actually measured it myself and I could only get a peak height of 77 inches, which for reference is about 6'4", but I'm at 5'10", and so you can see I personally have quite a bit of extra headroom inside of this tent. And another great thing about the layout of this tent is of course the vestibule space or the mudroom, because this is a really cool extra space that'll keep you out of the rain, and you can fit a couple of full-size camp chairs in here with no problem at all. So if you want to store extra gear, you want to have an extra rain fly that comes bundled in with your tent, then this is a really nice layout feature. So overall, I would say the good things about the layout of this tent vastly outweigh the downsides, especially if you don't need to fit actually 6 people in here. And so I give this an 8 out of 10. The third category to look at is the sleep capacity of the tent. So this is related to the floor area, but let's get into this because this is interesting. So a 6-person tent could be different sizes. There is no industry standard that determines what is a 6-person tent, a 4-person tent, and so on. So the manufacturers can actually label it however they want, which is what makes it really important to look at the real dimensions of the tent or to watch a video like this one where we can put it to the test. So let's see how many sleeping pads will actually fit inside here. Now you can see as I'm laying out these sleeping pads in the little clip here that I can't quite get that 6th sleeping pad to fit very well. And so I would call this maybe a 5.5-person tent if you really want to pack people in there like sardines. But I think to call it a 6-person tent is a bit of a stretch, which will cost it some points in my scoring system. But if you're a more luxurious camper and you're not really interested in the little sleeping pads and you want to put in a larger air mattress, you can see that you actually can fit in a large queen size mattress or my Exped Duo sleeping pad side by side at the same time. It's a bit tighter than it would have been in another 6-person tent, for example, the Eureka Copper Canyon, which is a much larger 6-person tent, but it still fits. So in summary, because this tent doesn't quite meet its rated capacity of 6 people, I'll give it a slightly below average score of 4 out of 10. Category number 4 is the door score. Now the doors on a tent is really important because it's one of the parts of the tent that you'll interact with the most. It's also one of the parts of the tent that will become most frustrating if it doesn't work well. So there's a few things I like to look at when it comes to the doors. First is the number of doors, second is the size of those doors, and third is the quality of the zippers. So let's look at each of those. First, the number of doors. This tent does have 2 doors, though they are of different sizes. So let's go straight into the sizes of those doors. First, up front, you have a really, really big door, and I love that this door zips all the way up to the top, and you can even roll it up and fasten it at the top of the tent, which gives you this nice ability to open up the space so you can kind of make the vestibule space of the tent an extended living room when you have the side zip down, and then that door at the middle is out of the way. And then if you look at the back of the tent, there is an additional much smaller door. And I actually didn't think there was a second door at first because this door was so small. Now, because of that large door up front, I think that kind of compensates because it would still be really easy to get something like a large air mattress in and out of the tent using the front door. And then you do have the flexibility of allowing people to go in and out, for example, for nighttime bathroom breaks through that smaller door in the back. And so that's the number of doors. Now let's talk about the quality of the zippers on this tent. The zippers are actually of pretty good quality. I was able to zip them around with one hand without getting snagged on anything, which is really nice. And that's not the case with some other tents. For example, the Eureka Copper Canyon LX is another 6-person tent, and I find the zipper on that to be very frustrating. And so the zippers overall, the experience of using them is very good on the North Face Wawona 6. One thing I would note though is that the zippers are not YKK brand. They worked very well in my testing, to be fair, but YKK brand is broadly recognized as the leading manufacturer of zippers, and their zippers do tend to work better and last longer than the competition. So we'll see over a long period of time, maybe this tent's zippers will do well, but that is something to pay attention to if you care about having YKK brand zippers. Overall, I think the good vastly outweighs the bad when it comes to the doors on this tent, and so I'm gonna give it a high score of 8 out of 10. Category number 5 is the storage, and that's actually one of the best features of this tent. And if you look at the inside of the main body of the tent, you'll find 2 storage pouches that are on either side near the main door up front. This is good if you wanna put a headlamp or maybe some keys or your phone in a pouch while you're lying down. And then there's also additional storage pouches on the back of the tent. There's 3 over the back small door, which is interesting, and I think that kind of gives a sign that North Face thinks that some people won't actually use that back door at all for going in and out. And there's an additional 4 storage pouches that are just above that smaller back door. But when it comes to storage, really the star of the show for the Wawona is that huge extra vestibule space that goes to the outside of the tent. You could store a ton of gear out here, including camping chairs, backpacks, whatever else you have that you can put outside of the main body of the tent, but you still want to be protected from the rain. And so if you take all of these things together, I think this tent has exceptional storage, and I give it a 10 out of 10. Category number 6 is the weatherproofing of the tent. Now this is of course one of the most important categories for any tent, and I did in fact test this tent in multiple days of rain and even high 15 to 25 mile per hour winds, in addition to the nice sunny weather like we have here today. Now let's talk in particular about how this tent did in the rain and in the high winds. During my testing on rainy days, when I had the rain fly and everything secured like it should be, I didn't notice any leaks, which is really good. Of course, we don't want anything leaking in the tent. Really, the only concern I would have about this tent in the rain is if you look at the side of the tent where the rain fly goes over the upper mesh paneling, there doesn't seem to be very much space underneath where the mesh goes when it comes to the rain fly. And so I could imagine that with just the right angle of wind, you might get some rain in there up through that mesh paneling, but that's nothing but speculation because I didn't have any problems with that during my testing. When it comes to the wind, this tent again did quite well. But in comparison to some other tents, you could tell that it didn't stand up quite as securely in the wind as some others did. So if we compare this to something like the REI Base Camp, for instance, which I kind of call the polyester fortress, this one didn't do quite as well. And if you look at the high winds, you can see that the sides of this tent and sort of the wide portion where there are no additional support poles, it kind of bows in a little bit. Now that's not a huge issue. It didn't blow the tent away or anything like that, but it is something to pay attention to if you go camping in places that have very high winds and you care about having a little bit of bow in there like this one did. And like I said, if you compare this to something like the REI Base Camp, the internal structure of that tent does have additional cross poles, which allows it to be a little bit more sturdy than this one. But overall, I would say this tent is well above average when it comes to weatherproofing, and it surpassed all of my tests when it came to rain and wind, and so I will give it an 8 out of 10. Category number 7 is the ventilation, and this is again another category of this tent that I think performs very well. If you look at the front door of the tent, you'll see a huge amount of ventilation, and then if you look over the top of the tent, you get more ventilation there, and if you look at the small door on the back, that can actually be unzipped to provide additional ventilation because it has a mesh panel there. And then an interesting feature of this tent is that it also has little zippered portions on the top of the tent, sort of down the side a little bit, that you can undo and roll up in order to create additional ventilation for that top mesh panel. Now, the only gripe I really have about the ventilation of this tent is I could imagine that the side ventilation panels or the side mesh panels could go down farther, but for what it is, I think it is still well above average and a high-performing tent when it comes to ventilation, and I give it a score of 7 out of 10. Next category to look at is the overall build quality of the tent. And there's a few things that I like to look at in particular, and that is the materials that the fabric of the tent is made out of. Number 2 is the poles that the tent is made with. Number 3 is the stakes, and then finally it's the architecture or the structural integrity of the tent's design. So let's go through each one of those. So if we look at the fabric of this tent, I think it's really interesting to mention that if we compare this $475 tent to something like the REI Wonderland, which is a $599 or a $600 tent, that the fabrics appear to be about the same. So the canopy and the rainfly of this tent are both made out of a polyester 75 denier material, and if you're not familiar with that terminology, denier basically means the thickness of the fibers that make up the fabric, and usually a higher number there is going to mean a more durable fabric. And so then if you look at the floor, the fabric is a bit different, and it uses 150 denier polyester material, which is again the same as the REI Wonderland, and it's better than other tents, for example the Eureka Copper Canyon, which does have that 75 denier canopy and rainfly, but it has the lower 75 denier floor compared to the North Face Wawona, which has a 150 denier floor. If that's too much information jumping around in this section, then just suffice to say that this tent, for its price, has a comparable material quality to something like the more expensive REI Wonderland. Now let's talk about the poles. This tent does have DAC or DAC poles, which is an aluminum alloy, and I did a bit of research about this, and apparently this type of pole is supposed to have a higher strength to weight ratio than your average run-of-the-mill aluminum poles. And just using my own little eye test and comparing this to poles on something like the REI Basecamp, I did find these DAC poles to be lighter weight and a bit easier to use, so that's something to keep in mind. Third, if we look at the stakes that came along with this tent, you'll notice that they do seem to be pretty thick and hardy and durable, and that's also true in my testing. But if you look at how the stakes are designed, you might notice in comparison to other tents that have a little bit different stakes that they don't have any point on the end. So it's a blunt end on the end of the stake, which if you're trying to drive it into sand or something hard like that, it can really help to have a pointed end, and this tent doesn't have that in the stakes. And so I ding that a little bit, but that's kind of a tiny consideration because overall the stakes are solid. Finally, if we talk about the structural integrity of this tent or the overall architecture of how it's designed, I would say that the quality of that is quite high. I would say it's much better than something in a less expensive tent like the Eureka Copper Canyon LX or a budget tent like the Coleman Sky Dome. This has a much stronger structure than those tents. However, if you compare it to something like the REI Basecamp, which has an incredibly sturdy design, this isn't quite on that same level. And as I mentioned in the weatherproofing segment, you can kind of see in high winds that the sides of the tent do bow in a little bit with that wind pressure, and you don't see that nearly as much with something like the REI Basecamp, which has a additional cross pole going in that area to reinforce the structure of the tent. So I bring this down a couple points under the REI Basecamp when it comes to structural integrity, and if you sum all of this up for the build quality segment, I give the North Face Wawona 6 a build quality score of 7 out of 10. The next category is the cool factor. So the cool factor is where I like to reward tents that have a really cool, interesting, fun, or unique design, and it's also where I penalize tents that have a really odd or wonky feature to it or just kind of strange or not nice in some way. And so this North Face Wawona tent, I love the design of this tent. I think it's really a cool tent, and sure, it does look a little bit unusual, but it's basically taking a regular dome style tent, expanding the headroom with its cross pole, and then expanding out the rainfly to create an additional rainfly area. And I love that you can raise that door in the middle in order to extend the living space. So basically, if you buy this tent, you're getting both a pretty good dome style tent and you're getting an additional rainfly area, which you can buy separately, but that's gonna cost you maybe about $100 to get a separate rainfly that's of good quality. And so this is kind of a 2-in-1 deal, and it's got this nice hangout space that's built right into the tent. I just think it's awesome. So I give it a cool score of 9 out of 10. The final category is packing. And when it comes to packing, I like to look at two things. First, I like to look at how easy is it to disassemble the tent and put it back in its original bag. And then second, I like to look at how well does this pack away in the back of your trunk with the rest of your gear. In other words, how compact is it? So let's look at each of those. So first of all, I found this tent relatively easy to disassemble and pack away. It's worth mentioning that the poles actually stuck together better than I would have expected, which makes them easier to pull through those sleeves on the top of the Rainflyer tent. So that's worth paying attention to. Also, the stuff sack that came with this bag is my favorite of any tent that I've reviewed this year. I think I might have said in a previous video that that was the Eureka Copper Canyon LX 6 bag, but it's actually this bag because it's big, it opens from the side or the top, and so you don't have to stuff it into a narrow space. You have this huge amount of room that you can take the whole tent, roll it up, and just kind of roll it in there, and then you can zipper it shut with the shock cord on top. So I think this is the easiest stuff sack to use out of any tent that I've reviewed so far this year. And then if you look at how this tent, when it's all packed away, looks in the back of my Toyota RAV4, you'll see that it does take a decent amount of space. I would say it takes a bit more space than average. It takes more space than something like the Eureka Copper Canyon LX6, I think, but it probably takes a little bit less space than the REI Wonder Dome, which it seems to be a bit bigger package. So overall, I give this tent a score of 6 out of 10 for the packing category. In summary, I gave this tent an overall score of 65 out of 100. For reference, I do consider a score of 50 points to be a roughly average quality tent, which means at 65 points, the North Face Wawona 6 is squarely in the premium, high quality tent category. Now, who should actually buy this tent? Well, in my opinion, I think there are two groups of people who will find this tent particularly appealing. Number one, if you're somebody who wants the features and the quality of a premium tent, but you don't want to spend more than $500, then this is one of the few tents that's going to give it to you. And actually, I think that this tent is one of the best values of any tent on the market for that reason. The second group of people who I think will really like this tent is anyone who really likes the 2-in-1 design, where you get your tent and then you also get an external rain fly that's kind of attached to it. If you love that design and that feature, then you should definitely put this tent on your list. But if you're not sure that this is exactly the right tent for you, then go ahead and check out this video I did, where I did a roundup of the 6 most popular family camping tents that are currently on the market. So go ahead and check that out right here.